Welcome to the 27th episode of Let's Talk About Electric Vehicles. This is a podcast about the technology and economics of electrified transportation systems. My name is Theo. I've been co-hosting with Teresa over the last few episodes, and today I'm flying solo for the second time. So please forgive the, awkwardness. Today I'm going to dig into the internal workings of lithium-ion batteries. Lithium-ion is the dominant battery chemistry for electric cars today. It'll be a pretty sciencey episode with compounds and elements and ions and such, but I'll try to keep it interesting. That said, if you are new to battery chemistry, I'd encourage you to listen to episode 25, the ABCs of batteries. In that episode, I went through the history and chemistry of batteries in general and laid some groundwork. I'll go through it very briefly now, just as a refresher. So every battery has a positive electrode, also known as a cathode, and a negative electrode, also known as an anode. In my previous episode, I used the terms anode and cathode, but in this episode I'm going to use negative electrode and positive electrode based on some super helpful feedback I received. Alright, so a quick overview of how a rechargeable battery works. We have a positive electrode and a negative electrode. And when a battery charger is charging a battery, it pulls electrons from the positive electrode and pushes them onto the negative electrode. When it does that, a chemical reaction inside the battery stores those electrons for later. When you later discharge the battery, for example by turning on your electric vehicle motor, the chemical reaction reverses and pushes electrons the other way, from the negative electrode through your load and over to the positive electrode. As the electrons pass through your load uses their energy, like to move your car. This is the general idea for all rechargeable batteries, but lithium-ion batteries are particularly good at storing all those electrons and then offering them back up when needed by the load. And the way that lithium-ion batteries make this all happen is pretty fascinating. So, without further ado, let's talk about lithium-ion batteries. So first, a bit of a clarification. There are actually two types of batteries with lithium in their names. Lithium ion is obviously one, but lithium metal is the other. The little flat batteries in hearing aids and watches are lithium metal batteries. Energizer Lithium and other similar brands are also lithium metal. Lithium metal batteries are not rechargeable, but have a very long shelf life and hold a lot of energy for their size and weight. Lithium metal batteries are often referred to simply as lithium batteries, which can be confusing. But we've come here today, at least virtually come here, to talk about lithium-ion batteries, so back to that. And let's start with the name, lithium-ion. Obviously there are lithium ions in there, but first, what's an ion? An ion is an atom of a given element, say lithium, that's missing one of its electrons or that has an extra electron. If an electron is missing from an atom, that makes the atom a positive ion because electrons are negative. It's like if you're missing something negative, it makes you more positive. If you're less sad, then you're more happy. On the other hand, if an atom has an extra electron, then that would make it a negative ion because it's more sad, so it's less happy. Yeah, that's a weird metaphor. But anyway, back to lithium. Lithium ions are positive ions. They are happily missing a negative electron. As you might guess, having an empty electron slot, because you're missing an electron, is useful when you're trying to store electricity, which is made of electrons. It's like you have a little electron house in each tiny little lithium ion. And that electron house is just waiting for an electron to move in. Okay, next I'll talk about how the chemical reaction that stores and releases electricity in a lithium-ion battery works. So, how do these little lithium electron houses, ions, actually store and release electricity? Well, in short, the negative and positive electrodes in a lithium-ion battery are both designed so that they can trap huge numbers of lithium ions, which in turn trap electrons. So how do lithium electron houses, lithium ions, actually store and release electricity? Well, in short, the negative and positive electrodes of a lithium-ion battery are both designed so that they can trap huge numbers of lithium ions, together with huge numbers of electrons. At a conceptual level, trapping electrons leads to stored electricity. One way to visualize the electrodes, both negative and positive, is that they're like sponges, but instead of absorbing water, they like to absorb lithium ions and electrons. And of course, when lithium ions and electrons come together inside the sponge, they actually form lithium inside the sponge. A charged lithium-ion battery has most of its lithium ions and electrons, and therefore most of its lithium, trapped inside the negative electrode, or inside the negative electrode's sponge. So the negative electrode sponge is full of lithium. A discharged lithium-ion battery, on the other hand, has most of its lithium trapped in the positive electrode, or trapped in that sponge. So basically, the charge state of a lithium-ion battery depends on where the lithium is. If it's on the negative side, then it's a charged battery, and if it's on the positive side, then it's a discharged battery. So as you might guess, charging a lithium-ion battery is all about moving the lithium and therefore the electrons from the positive electrode over to the negative electrode. And the way that you do that moving is the battery charger literally pulls electrons off the positive electrode and pushes them onto the negative electrode. The loss of electrons from the positive electrode causes the lithium in the positive electrode to break down, and the lithium ions that are in the positive electrode as a result, they release into the electrolyte. The lithium ions, then quickly move through the electrolyte over towards the negative electrode, where they join up with the electrons that the charger is pushing onto the negative electrode. Remember, the charger's pulling from positive and pushing to negative. And then when those lithium ions and electrons join up at the negative electrode, they become trapped in the negative electrode material. So they're like soaking into that sponge. And they get trapped there in the form of a lithium compound that's based on lithium ion and electron bonded with whatever the negative electrode is made of. When charging is complete, the lithium compound is happy to stay in the negative electrode as long as there's nowhere for the trapped electrons to go, i.e. as long as there's no load. So that sponge stays soaked with lithium as long as there's no load. But then, when a load is applied to the battery, say the electric motor is turned on, that gives the trapped electrons somewhere to go. The lithium compound that's living in the negative electrode becomes unstable and realizes that it doesn't really want to be a compound anymore. It breaks up, releasing electrons from the negative electrode to the load and releasing lithium ions back into the electrolyte. It's like the sponge all of a sudden doesn't want to hold water anymore, and it all runs out, except it runs out in the form of electrons in one direction and lithium ions in the other direction. And as this discharge is happening, and as the electrons are flowing off and the lithium ions are flowing off of the negative electrode, on the other side of the electrolyte, the positive electrode realizes that it actually wants the lithium ions back. So the lithium ions flow back through the electrolyte and merge into the positive electrode, joining up with the electrons that were released from the negative electrode and went through the load. And that forms a lithium compound now in the positive electrode. The lithium compound formed in the positive electrode is different than the one formed in the negative electrode, and the materials these electrodes are made of are different, but we'll dig more into that later. This process goes back and forth with each recharge-discharge cycle, with lithium ions being pushed and pulled back and forth through the electrolyte, and joining up with electrons which are being pushed and pulled back and forth the long way through the battery charger or through the electric motor. Going back to the sponge analogy, the lithium ions and electrons are alternately soaking the negative electrode and then soaking the positive electrode and then soaking the negative electrode with each discharge and recharge and discharge cycle. Okay, so now we've talked about the general chemical process that's going on. Now let's get into which materials are involved, other than lithium. We'll start with the negative electrode, which is made of the simplest material. Most lithium-ion negative electrodes today are made of graphite, which is simply carbon atoms arranged in a specific way. The nice thing about graphite, other than the fact that it makes excellent lead in your number 2 pencil, is that its structure at the atomic level is really good at trapping tiny things, like lithium atoms. So it's a really good sponge. So when the battery is charging, the lithium ions pass through the electrolyte to the negative electrode, which is made of carbon, and meet up with electrons that are being pushed there by the battery charger the long way around. The electrons fill in the lithium ion's empty spots, and the newly minted lithium, which is now no longer an ion because it's gained an electron, bonds with the carbon in the negative electrode. Okay, that was the negative electrode material. Now let's move to the positive electrode material. There's a lot of variants of materials on this side of the battery, and these materials are where lithium-ion battery chemistries get their names. For example, you might have heard of lithium iron phosphate or lithium cobalt oxide. Or you may have heard that Tesla batteries use a lithium nickel cobalt aluminum oxide, or some abbreviation of these. These are all variations of the same idea. They're all compounds that contain lithium and are good at giving up that lithium in the form of lithium ions, and then also good at reclaiming it, depending on the electrical charge situation. So they're good sponges. And next, let's talk about the electrolyte, the stuff that's kind of in between the positive electrode and the negative electrode. So the key characteristic of electrolyte material is that it needs to let the lithium ions pass super easily back and forth between the negative and positive electrodes, while at the same time not allowing electrons themselves to pass easily. The electrons, remember, have to go the long way around through your load. Lithium-ion battery electrolytes are usually composed of what's called a lithium salt that's dissolved in a solvent. So let's break that down. First, what's a lithium salt? What's a salt in general? So a salt is a chemical compound made from a positive ion of one element joining with a negative ion from another element. In the case of table salt, these two ions are sodium, the positive one, and chloride, the negative one. In a lithium salt, the positive ion is lithium. Remember lithium? This is an episode about lithium. And the negative ion is something that likes mating up with lithium. One example is something called hexafluorophosphate. So when lithium meets up with hexafluorophosphate, you get lithium hexafluorophosphate, which is a lithium salt. Just like when you combine sodium and chloride, you get table salt. So that's the lithium salt part of the electrolyte. The other part of the electrolyte is the solvent that the lithium salt gets dissolved in. So what's a solvent? A solvent is just a liquid that dissolves solids. Water is a solvent. It's really good at dissolving table salt, for example. But water is not a great solvent to use in lithium-ion batteries. Instead, they tend to use other solvents that happen to be quite flammable. The solvents chosen for lithium-ion batteries need to meet a few requirements. They need to resist the direct movement of electrons between the two electrodes. They need to encourage the movement of lithium ions between the electrodes. And they need to be chemically friendly to both negative and positive electrodes, basically allowing those electrodes to stay in a nice stable form when the battery isn't being used. You can imagine if the electrolyte was super caustic, it might melt the electrodes, which would be bad. Okay, so we've talked about negative and positive electrode materials. We've talked about electrolyte materials. Now I have to sneak one more battery component in on you, and that is called the separator. Separator. In addition to having electrolyte between the two electrodes, lithium-ion batteries have a thin material called a separator. Creative name, right? The separator is actually super important. It prevents physical contact between the electrodes. This allows the electrolyte layer to be super thin as well, which makes the battery smaller, lighter, and better in many ways. Separators are mostly made from a thin plastic with zillions of tiny holes in it. This allows for another benefit of the separator. It can be designed so that when the battery starts overheating, or if the battery starts overheating, The tiny holes in the separator effectively melt closed, shutting down the reactions that are occurring inside the battery and potentially preventing fires and explosions. Okay, so now we've talked about the general chemical processes that happen inside a lithium-ion battery, and we've talked about the materials that the components, the negative electrode, the positive electrode, the electrolyte, and the separator are made of. But it's been pretty abstract. Now let's talk about how these pieces actually look in the real world, how they all get combined together into a battery that makes your electric car go. The key to thinking about all these components in their physical form in a lithium-ion battery is that they are made very thin. Both of the electrodes are thin, the separator is thin, and the electrolyte is thin, thanks in part to the presence of the separator. How thin? Well, we're talking tiny fractions of a millimeter. This extreme thinness allows the materials to be laid down flat, like a really thin layer cake. Of course, if you just laid them out flat, you'd have a really big flat battery, not much use. So the layer cakes are actually made very flat in long, thin strips. And the strips are then rolled up like a jelly roll, allowing a long, thin strip to fit into a much smaller space. In the case of Tesla batteries, this rolled up jelly roll ends up being about the size of a conventional AA battery. Then to make a full EV battery pack big enough to drive your car, thousands of these little jelly rolls are all wired together. There are also other battery shapes that aren't cylindrical like a AA battery, but the basic principle is the same. Take a big flat sheet of super thin lithium-ion battery material and roll it up to fit in some container. As you can imagine, there's a lot of research going on in the realm of lithium-ion batteries. Each component is being improved, but my understanding is that the electrolyte is the area where the most innovation is taking place. For example, Tesla is working with Jeff Dahn at Dalhousie University, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, on a lithium-ion battery capable of lasting 1 million miles worth of charge cycles versus the 100 to 500,000 miles of current car batteries. When they announced the success of the project, they happily announced the composition of the electrodes, but did not release the composition of the electrolyte. One reason that electrolytes are so important is that they contribute an additional little feature to the system. On the first charging of a lithium-ion battery, the electrolyte around the negative electrode decomposes a little bit. It does this kind of when it's giving up its lithium ions into the negative electrode. And this decomposition leaves a layer on the negative electrode, a little coating. This layer is called the solid electrolyte interface, or SEI. The SEI, when it's just right, actually helps prevent discharge and helps prevent further decomposition of the electrolyte. Other electrolyte work includes research into electrolytes that provide more lithium flow, less electron flow, into solid electrolytes, and into electrolytes that use solvents that are less dangerous. There are also advancements taking place in the separator to make batteries safer and to even further reduce the movement of electrons across the electrolyte inside the battery. Remember, the electrons are supposed to take the long way around through the load. And of course, there is research into improvements in the negative and positive electrodes themselves. Potential improvements there could result in lighter batteries, higher capacity, longer life, less expensive materials, and more. Okay, we're almost at the end of this very long and very science-y episode. Let's do a quick review of everything we've talked about so far. First, I tried to clear up potential confusion that stems from the two types of batteries that have lithium in their names. Lithium metal versus lithium ion. Lithium metal batteries, sometimes just called lithium batteries, are great, but not rechargeable, so not too useful for things like electric cars. Lithium-ion batteries are rechargeable and pretty much own the electric car market. By the way, cell phones also use lithium-ion batteries. Lithium-ion batteries got their name from the movement of lithium ions, that is, atoms of lithium that are missing an electron. And these lithium ions move back and forth through the electrolyte that's between the electrodes, and that's what allows for the storage and release of electricity. When a lithium-ion battery is charged, most of the lithium ions get trapped in the negative electrode along with electrons, forming a lithium carbon compound in the negative electrode. Then during discharge, the lithium carbon compound in the negative electrode gives up its electrons and also its lithium ions, which are released back into the electrolyte. They travel back to the positive electrode and join up with the electrons that have now traveled through the load, and the result is another lithium compound. Exactly what compound that is depends on the positive electrode material. And then we talked about materials. The negative electrode material is usually carbon in graphite or a similar form. Carbon is really good at trapping lithium ions and electrons together as lithium. The positive electrode material is some compound of lithium with other elements that also like to trap lithium ions and electrons. The electrolyte is a solvent containing elements that join with lithium ions to create lithium salts. This allows the lithium ions to move both ways between the negative electrode and positive electrode very easily. There's also a thin plastic separator in a lithium-ion battery, which helps in a bunch of ways, but basically keeps the negative electrode and the positive electrode separate. Then we talked about the physical structure of a lithium-ion battery. It's basically a super thin layer cake composed of a negative electrode, electrolyte, separator, a little more electrolyte, and then the positive electrode. And then this super thin layer cake gets rolled up into a jelly roll and shoved into some sort of case. Finally, there's a lot of research going into lithium batteries at the moment. We're likely to see improvements in longevity, capacity, weight, cost, safety, pretty much across the board. I'm really excited to see what the future holds for lithium-ion battery tech. Whew. Well, thank you for listening to probably the most sciencey episode ever of Let's Talk About Electric Vehicles. I hope you learned half as much listening to this episode as I did making it. This topic was super fun to research. If you have any feedback or future topic suggestions, please reach out either on Facebook or via email. And if you'd like to support our efforts, please join us on Patreon and rate the podcast in your favorite podcast app. Links for our Facebook, Patreon, email, and more are all on our website at evtalk.co. I'll be back next week to continue talking about lithium-ion batteries, but it'll be a bit less sciencey, thankfully. I'll be focusing on how long lithium batteries last in terms of recharge cycles, and how we can make them last longer. Until then, have a great week. Bye!